Thank you very much. That was a whirlwind tour of this great body of research. And now we get the complementary perspective from civil society. I'm also really delighted to welcome Ray Offenheiser back here to IFPRI. Ray joined Oxfam America as president in 1996. Under his leadership, Oxfam America has expanded more than sevenfold and positioned itself as the leading voice on international development and foreign policy in this area. Previously, he represented Ford Foundation in Bangladesh and the Andean and Southern Cone regions of South America. He's directed programs for the Inter-American Foundation in Brazil and Colombia, and worked for Save the Children Federation in Mexico. Ray served on numerous boards and advisory bodies, including World Economic Forum, Clinton Global Initiative, and the Council on Foreign Relations. He was co-founder and board member of the One campaign and the Food Policy Action Network. I'm also proud to say that his graduate work was in my own department of development sociology at Cornell. So welcome, Ray. Thank you. Sorry, I thought it was being...
No, I think we can do that.
Okay.
My computer skills are okay. Whoops. And where is it down here? Glasses will help. There we go. Okay. Well, Ruth, thanks for that introduction, and appreciate the plug for Cornell. And I'd like to thank colleagues and friends here at IFPRI for this opportunity to participate in this panel. And really that was a wonderful sort of overview of all that rich theoretical work that's in your report, and I hope everybody has an opportunity to read it. I do want to acknowledge and thank Stuti and the team at the Development Economics Department at the bank for this piece of work. It's not the kind of work that normally comes out of the bank, so you have to presume there's been a little bit of politics involved in getting that report done. We won't go into that, but presume that is the case. So, thank you to the bank and the economics team for that, and for IFPRI for holding this event, and hopefully more on this particular subject. What I'd like to do this morning, maybe to complement and to stimulate the discussion, less theoretical, a little bit more from an activist perspective, is maybe do 3 or 4 things. One is talk a little bit about the SDGs and what happened in New York last week, and what were some of the conversations that were going on there, and what kind of substance was really on the table last week in New York, because there was a lot of discussion about SDGs all over the city, in fora sponsored by the UN agencies, foundations, NGOs, the church, you name it. Everybody was talking about SDGs in a variety of different contexts and with different sorts of particular interests. And with that in mind, maybe just what were some of the big themes that were on the table last week that maybe are worth talking about? One of them was really I guess I would call it the meta theme for the week, which was business as usual is unacceptable. In other words, this is a moment in which we need to be thinking about the SDGs as a new way of doing business. But then the question is, what does that exactly mean? And I think I came out of the week feeling like it means a lot of different things to different people, depending on where you're coming from and the way you're looking at these issues. Some of them I'm trying to maybe sketch out for you there on that slide. One of them is a lot of people are still focused on their sectoral interests and are pushing hard on their sectoral interests to make their sectoral interests sort of give it primacy. Recognizing at the same time that these are all interlocking sort of issues and that need to be worked on collectively. So there's this challenge of how deep do I go in my sector versus how do I connect sectorally, on a horizontal basis. There's this whole discussion about, do we need to educate the world about the SDGs? And can we afford the time and money to do that? Or do we need to be much more targeted in the way we go about this? And there's a whole discussion about the public education dimensions of the SDG project. A lot of talk about partnerships, as there has been during the MDG process, and the fact that none of us can do this together. We need to do it with each other and look for various ways for there to be maybe counter-institutional or unusual kinds of partnerships across sectoral lines. It's all about the money, the whole question of where's the money going to come from, how is it going to be financed, and a little bit more of that discussion coming out of Addis about domestic resource mobilization, taxation at the national level, how are we going to help governments build tax capacity to actually finance these outcomes. Big focus on business, big event sponsored by the Secretary General in the Secretariat with business leaders from all over the world about the role of business in delivering on the SDGs. And interestingly, a lot of participation and a lot of conversations about how business is actually trying to figure out ways to connect their own internal strategic planning with the SDG process in a variety of interesting ways. And then, of course, a whole focus on big data and what data can do for this entire process, which is, I think, an important subject that maybe I'll come back to in some later comments. So let's focus a little bit on this question of what doing it differently on behalf of the SDGs might mean. And I'm going to take you into a bit of a whirlwind conversation about a rights-based approach, which is the way Oxfam approaches these issues, and really make the assertion that delivering on the SDGs will be, in fact, a political project, particularly at the national level, which is where impact must be felt and delivered, and where the politics is the most complex. Unlike the MDGs, this is not about an aggregated body of data indicating we've achieved some kind of an outcome globally, which we can all be satisfied with, but rather it's actually a focus on delivering and optimizing outcomes at the national level. So I'm going to maybe take you through a little bit of a history of Oxfam's journey into the space that Stuti has talked about. And maybe going back a few years, we actually came to a realization, had a little bit of crisis of conscience over the fact that we felt our programs weren't necessarily delivering the value that we thought they should be delivering. And we'd been involved in very much in kind of trying to empower grassroots communities for many years and working very much at problem solving at the grassroots level. But we were realizing more and more that communities were being victims of policies of government and by externalities that they couldn't control, and that in some ways that work at the grassroots was not enough. And we had to be thinking both about work at the national and even the global level to address some of these kinds of challenges that communities were facing, and the poor were facing particularly. And we began to sort of think about, well, what does that mean in terms of how we rethink our entire approach to this work? And one of the things we actually came to, which was a very simple thing, was how do we define poverty? And we realized we had accepted, in some sense, a default definition of poverty, which was the absence of public goods. And if you accept that definition, then your work on poverty is basically to deliver those public goods. But as an international NGO, we never have enough money. We never have enough capability. We're never going to deliver at scale. So we're set up to fail. And there's always going to be an enormous gap there. So then the question is, if that's really the case, maybe our definition at its base is wrong. And so after some reflection, we actually decided to use a different definition, which was poverty as social exclusion. The notion that certain groups are actually excluded for a variety of different reasons. Apartheid maybe being the most radical of those reasons, but it could be prices in the marketplace, it could be race issues. But when you start to dissemble where poverty lies in many societies, you will find that actually it's about social exclusion. And the World Bank, interestingly, did another very interesting paper about a year ago on social exclusion, which I recommend to you as well. It's a nice complement to this one. Where this led us was to think about, well, if poverty is about social exclusion, then what should we be focusing on? Well, we then realized we should be focusing on the barriers to inclusion. In other words, if we're thinking about inclusive growth or thinking about social inclusion, what are the barriers and how do we define them and maybe tackle them? And really, generally, they're about policies and practices in societies that need to be addressed and confronted very directly and unpacked in terms of how they're operationalized in a particular context. Then the question becomes, well, how do you do that in a kind of a civil way? And we then realized that the best way to do that was actually to take a rights-based approach to this, in which we were assuming that people had economic and social rights as well as civil and political rights, and we should be talking about their right to food and their right to housing and employment or decent lives, decent livelihoods and so forth, and make that kind of a core of the way we were doing things and advance a kind of civil discourse with the state as the duty bearer under a rights arrangement, and really in some sense engender a discussion about the social contract in any society in order to kind of improve conditions. Now, we didn't do this in terms of a broad discussion of social contract, but we then began to do it in a very strategic way that focused on particular issues, for particular barriers and particular kinds of outcomes that we were pursuing. And I'll give you some examples of that toward the end of my comments this morning. So within this framework, really, this particular slide is in some sense where we came out. It's collapsing a lot of information, but basically, our conclusion was really that to get the kind of outcomes we need for the SDGs, we need effective states that are delivering on rights for their citizens. We need active citizens, basically holding that government accountable for those agreements and pushing government to actually be more progressive in terms of inclusion. And we need an inclusive marketplace. And we rely on the government in some sense to actually define what an inclusive market, inclusive economic growth would actually be. And the assumption here is that there needs to be sort of advocacy and work on innovation and advocacy going on between civil society and the state, as well as civil society and the market actors, as well as particular companies and around particular issues that may have a bearing in a particular national context. So that's kind of our, if you will, theoretical framework in a nutshell, and I'm happy to talk about it in more detail in the Q&A. I think at the end of the day, really, at the core of this is an assumption that the market is more morally neutral, and states don't necessarily move without incentives. And so in some sense, I guess at the core of this is the assumption that civil society has to be pushing both the state and the market to deliver, if you will, morally suitable outcomes in terms of delivery of public goods and inclusion and rights for access to basic services and to, in some cases, for indigenous groups, land and/or water access. So what I want to talk about now is actually a challenge to some sense the model that we have actually put forward, which is this notion of civil society playing an important role in holding governments and the marketplace accountable. And I want to just maybe offer a quick reflection a little bit on what Stuti was talking about in terms of increase of democratic institutions. She's absolutely right. Over the last 25, 30 years that many of us have been working on development issues, we've seen many societies move from authoritarian or autocratic regimes to democratic regimes and build stronger and more competent democratic institutions. But now what's happening is there's a closing of civil society space all over the world, and there's a Freedom House report out that basically asserts that some 90 plus countries are actually introducing legislation on civil society space, on use of cyber technology for information gathering, for transparency, and a variety of other kinds of very ingenious ways of closing down on public philanthropy to limit civil society action in ways that would enable this kind of accountability that we're talking about this morning. So, so we're living this paradox, and for Oxfam at this point in time, we're actually seeing it have really harmful effects not only on our work, but many of the individuals leading this particular kind of work. So, we're seeing arrests of people, harassment of people, fining of individuals who are speaking out. On one particular case in Tanzania, a gentleman actually made a critical comment about the president on Facebook a posting, and basically was jailed and then charged basically $3,000 for the suspension of his sentence. So this is basically becoming more and more of an issue. I want to say a little bit about data, and I think there's a rich discussion to be had about data, and Stuti, I think, started that conversation a little bit around the transparency question. I think there's a lot of questions about data for who. Governments have been gathering a lot of data for literally decades. I did a thesis using census data from Mexico, literally, I'm not going to tell you how many years ago, I'll just say several decades. And it was a rich data source. But there's even more of that kind of data today. I think the question really today is data for who, for what purpose, and who owns it, and how accessible is it? And I guess I would argue that really in some ways we need to be thinking a lot about maybe unusual sources of data, maybe more in the hands of a new generation of institutions and civil society institutions who are really focused on particular problems and particularly around some of these particular societal grievances that would deliver SDG outcomes, and not merely data in the hands of civil servants. So I think we need to think broadly about the issue of data and data ownership and data generation. What I'd like to do is maybe quickly talk about a couple of cases that in which we see some of the kind of outcomes that we might hope for, that I think illustrate a little bit of what Stuti's talking about, and a little bit of what Oxfam is talking about in terms of a rights-based approach. I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 campaigns very quickly, and I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to give you some, I'm going to tease you a little bit and hope you'll ask a couple of questions about these. Burkina Faso is a country that exports enormous amounts of gold, generates a lot of wealth from gold, and but doesn't necessarily capture a lot of it for the national accounts. And so, but it has the potential to deliver on SDGs by investing revenue from that gold into public services and public goods. So Oxfam actually supported a campaign with civil society actors in Burkina Faso, and the idea was to capture 1% of gross revenue from gold on an annual basis and put that toward development outcomes. That was a campaign that used all the tools of social media, political mobilization that are current today, and actually used evidence to kind of make the case for how this could benefit the general population, got citizens interested in this, and they won basically the battle and got 1% of gold, gross gold revenues for development outcomes. The second one I want to talk about quickly is a similar one in Ghana, where, you know, you're maybe aware that historically there's been major gold strikes, and there's a large oil strikes, and there's enormous oil reserve there. And again, there's an opportunity to capture value and put it into development outcomes. Again, a campaign there went forward. Citizens with specialized groups working on the petroleum sector knew a lot about how the sector operated, what kind of revenue was being generated, put forward a campaign to actually capture 10 to 15% of annual revenue from the oil sector and put it into the agriculture sector. They not only got that victory, but they also won another victory by putting forward a new petroleum management law that actually tries to rationalize, in some sense, the petroleum industry's performance in Ghana. And maybe just 2 more I'll just talk about very quickly before concluding. One is reform of family law in Mozambique. This was an effort by a variety of women's groups to basically ensure that women could own property, inherit property, own businesses, guarantee education for young girls through high school, and recognize all forms of marriage. Again, a significant victory for a social movement in that country. And again, it was about a rights-based outcome. The last one really is just quickly the AIDS battle in South Africa, which was about access to medicines. And in this particular case, this was a battle of domestic civil society against global corporations to get an outcome in a national context that would allow, you know, generalized access to HIV/AIDS antiretrovirals. So it's an interesting case where civil society, in some sense, was aligned with the Mandela government against international capital, and secured an outcome that was positive for South Africa and later for the rest of the world. Bottom line here is there's an important role for civil society. Rights, I think, are an important platform, I think, for us to focus on, in addition to thinking about delivery of public goods, because in some ways a rights focus, I think, guarantees perhaps more sustainability over time. And I think that's one of the reasons why Oxfam has really, in some sense, anchored our work in a rights-based approach. So let me stop there. That's a lot to take in.